She closed her eyes on the altar and made peace with dying. After 26 years of being told she was worthless, Isabel had run out of fight. She was dying for a pack that had never wanted her. But the God who woke to the scent of her blood had other plans. He broke her chains. He healed her wound. He lifted her off the altar like she was something sacred. You were an alpha, he told the man who sacrificed her. Now you are nothing. This is the story of a sacrifice that became a salvation.
Let's begin.
The stone altar was cold against Isabel's bare back, the rough-hewn granite leaching what little warmth her trembling body had left. Above her, the sky was a merciless, star-scattered void, the full moon hanging like a severed, glowing eye witness to her sacrifice. She didn't struggle. Not anymore. The ropes around her wrists and ankles were thick with the memory of previous captives, frayed and stained. Struggling was a currency the pack elders enjoyed watching her spend. She learned that 3 days ago, when they dragged her from her childhood home, a small, dusty cottage at the edge of the territory she'd always been reminded she was lucky to live in. Lucky. The word was a bitter shard in her throat. Isabel, the Omega without a wolf, the daughter of the traitor who'd tried to flee with her as a babe. They'd killed her mother and let her live, a living reminder of their mercy. A debt they'd finally come to collect. For the wolf god, Alpha Arthur's voice boomed across the clearing, slick with false piety. He stood at the head of the gathered pack, his massive form draped in ceremonial furs, his jaw set in a mask of grim leadership. Beside him, his chosen mate, Olivia, clutched his arm, her expression one of serene satisfaction. The pack's healer, Charlotte, stood behind them, her face unreadable, a leather satchel of herbs hanging from her shoulder. Wesley, Arthur's beta and enforcer, held the torch that cast dancing, demonic shadows across the altar. Isabel stared at the dark opening of the cave behind the altar. The den. A fissure in the mountain that no wolf, not even Arthur in his prime, dared enter. It was the domain of the Ancient One, the wolf god their ancestors had bargained with for their power. A god who, according to legend, had grown silent for centuries. Now, with rogues pressing at their borders and a wasting sickness plaguing their pups, Arthur had declared the old covenant needed to be renewed, with blood, her blood. Isabel, daughter of Mara, your sacrifice is the tithe we pay for our strength, Arthur intoned, his voice a practiced rumble. He drew a ceremonial knife, its blade obsidian and wickedly sharp. Your life for the pack's salvation. She didn't close her eyes. She refused to give them that dignity. She looked past Arthur, past the 50-strong pack who had shunned her, mocked her and used her, and fixed her gaze on the inky blackness of the cave. A faint, primal scent emanated from it, ancient earth, old blood, and something else. Something vast and sleeping. Arthur approached, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. Wesley moved to hold her legs steady. Olivia's smile deepened. Any last words, wolfless one? Arthur murmured, so only she could hear, his piety replaced by a sneer of contempt. Isabel's voice was a dry rasp, but it carried in the silence. My mother said your god was dead. She said you killed him with your own arrogance. You're not sacrificing me to a god, Arthur. You're sacrificing me to your fear. A ripple of uneasy murmurs went through the pack. Arthur's face hardened, a vein pulsing in his temple. Enough! Drew the knife across her palm in a swift, practiced motion. The pain was a sharp, clean line. Isabel gasped, her fingers instinctively clenching as her blood welled up, dark and glistening in the moonlight. Arthur grabbed her wrist, holding her hand over the stone basin carved into the altar's head. One by one, her crimson drops fell into the basin. A slow, rhythmic drippy drip for a moment. Nothing happened. The pack held its breath. Arthur's confidence seemed to waver. Then a tremor ran through the ground, subtle at first, like a giant shifting in its sleep. The leaves on the trees began to rustle without wind. The torch in Wesley's hand guttered and flared green. From the depths of the cave, a sound emerged. Not a growl, not a howl, but a resonant, bone-deep hum that vibrated in Isabel's very marrow. It was a sound of waking. It is done, Arthur declared, a triumphant roar. The god accepts, never finished. A gust of wind, hot and smelling of petrichor and molten rock, exploded from the cave mouth. It wasn't natural. It was a breath. A slow, deliberate exhalation. Arthur stumbled back, shielding his face. The pack cowered, their wolves whining in their chests. Isabel lay pinned, unable to move, her blood still dripping into the basin. And then she saw them eyes. Two massive amber eyes, glowing with a consciousness that spanned millennia, opened in the darkness of the cave. They didn't look at Arthur or the cowering pack. They fixed on her. on the blood pooling in the stone basin. A low growl rumbled from the cave, a sound that wasn't aggression, but attention. Then he came. He didn't burst forth in a frenzy of fur and fang. He emerged with the slow, deliberate power of a tectonic shift. The ancient wolf god was not the monstrous, mindless beast of legend. He was a wolf of impossible size, his fur the color of charcoal and starlight, every muscle beneath it coiled with a power that made Arthur look like a pup. Scars, silver and ancient, crossed his muzzle and flank. He was a king in his own right, a force of nature given form. He ignored the gasps, the screams, the way Alpha Arthur fell to his knees, his earlier bravado shattered. The god's gaze never left Isabel. He padded towards the altar, each step silent despite his size. He stopped beside her, his immense head lowering. His muzzle, as wide as her torso, hovered over her bleeding hand. Isabel's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but a strange stillness settled over her. His scent washed over her, forests older than time, winter air, and a spark of something that felt like destiny. He was going to finish it. A single snap of his jaws would end her. He extended his tongue. It was a rough, hot velvet that lapped at her palm with shocking gentleness. He tasted her blood, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second as if savoring a flavor long forgotten. A sound rumbled from his chest, a low, resonant sound that was almost a purr. When his eyes opened again, they were no longer just amber. They flickered with a piercing, intelligent gold. He raised his head, and for the first time his gaze swept over the pack, over Arthur, trembling on his knees, over Olivia, whose face was a mask of horrified disbelief, over Charlotte, who had pressed a hand to her mouth, and Wesley, whose torch had fallen to the ground. The wolf god looked at the pack that had offered a sacrifice, and then he looked at what they had given him. And he did the unthinkable. He lowered his massive head, his powerful jaws closing not around Isabel's throat, but around the thick ropes binding her wrists. With a single, precise slice of his fangs, the rope fell away. He moved to her ankles, doing the same, his breath hot against her skin. The bonds fell slack. A collective gasp choked the clearing. Isabel lay frozen, her arms and legs free, her bleeding hand cradled against her chest. The god stepped back, his massive form a wall of power between her and the pack. He looked at her, and in his ancient eyes she didn't see a sacrifice. She saw a choice. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up to a sitting position on the altar. The pack stared, some in terror, others in open fury. Arthur's face was purple with rage and humiliation. "The tithe is accepted," Arthur shouted, trying to regain control. He pointed a shaking finger at Isabel. "She belongs to the god now." "Her life is forfeit, her blood." The wolf god moved. He didn't charge. He simply turned his head, fixing Arthur with a gaze of such pure predatory authority that the alpha's voice died in his throat. A sound, a low, guttural snarl that was less a warning and more a pronouncement of judgment, emanated from the god. Then something even more shocking happened. The god began to shift. It wasn't the violent, bone-cracking transformation of a werewolf. It was a ripple of shadow and light, a coalescing of form. The immense wolf seemed to fold in on itself, the starlit fur receding, the powerful limbs reshaping. In the space of a breath, the ancient wolf god was gone. A man stood in his place. He was tall, far taller than Arthur, with a lean, corded physique that spoke of a predator's grace. His hair was the same charcoal black as his fur, falling in waves past his shoulders. His face was sharp, angular, beautiful in a way that was almost painful to look upon, etched with the wisdom and weariness of ages. Scars, identical to those on the wolf's form, traced silvery lines across his cheek and the back of his hands. And his eyes, they were the same. Those piercing, golden, inhuman eyes. He was naked, unashamed, and utterly, terrifyingly powerful. He paid no mind to the pack's cries of shock and horror. He turned to Isabel, who sat frozen on the altar, her bloody hand still outstretched. He took her hand. His touch was warm, electric. He lifted her bleeding palm to his lips. And as his mouth closed over the wound, she felt no pain, only a searing heat that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. When he pulled back, the gash Arthur had made was gone. Not healed, but erased, as if it had never been. He looked at Arthur, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it resonated in the very ground beneath their feet, in the marrow of their bones. "You offered her as a tithe," the god said, his golden gaze unwavering. "A life for your salvation." Turned back to Isabel, his expression unreadable. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. His thumb traced her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. "You are not a sacrifice. he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. You are the answer. Then he looked at the pack once more, and the temperature in the clearing plummeted. The covenant is void, he declared, his voice a crack of divine thunder. Your power was borrowed. It is now revoked. Reached down and with a strength that defied comprehension, lifted Isabel into his arms as if she weighed nothing. She was too stunned to resist, her body instinctively curling against the impossible warmth of his chest. Arthur roared, surging to his feet, his wolf breaking through his skin, his form beginning to shift. That power is mine. She is mine. I am the Alpha. The god looked at him, and for the first time a flicker of true, terrifying emotion crossed his features. It was not anger, it was disappointment. It was the judgment of a king who had found his subjects wanting. He lifted a hand, and a pulse of pure force slammed into Arthur, throwing him back into the gathered pack. They crumpled like felled trees. You were an Alpha, the god said, turning his back on them. He began to walk towards the cave, Isabel held securely against him. Now you are nothing, carried her into the darkness of his domain. As the shadows swallowed them, Isabel heard the pack's screams of panic and rage turn to howls of fear as they felt the power drain from their blood. Their wolves, their strength, their very birthright, fading like mist in the morning sun. She looked up at the face of the ancient being who held her, his sharp profile illuminated by the faint, ethereal glow that now seemed to emanate from within the cave. She whispered, her voice trembling. He looked down at her, and in his golden eyes she saw not the coldness of a god but the flicker of something far more dangerous. A deep, consuming loneliness that had spanned centuries. Because for 1,000 years they have offered me blood, fear, and obedience, he said, his voice a low vibration against her skin. And you, Isabel, are the first to offer me silence. You did not beg. You did not bargain. You simply were. He carried her deeper into the earth, the weight of her life as a sacrifice falling away with each step, replaced by something she couldn't yet name. Outside, her pack was crumbling, their power shattered. But in the arms of the wolf god, Isabel realized she had never been less afraid. Her life had begun at the moment they had tried to end it. The darkness of the cave was not empty. Isabel had expected cold, damp stone, the suffocating weight of earth pressing in from all sides. Instead, the moment the god carried her past the threshold, the world transformed. The walls began to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light, veins of crystal that pulsed like a slow heartbeat, illuminating a passage wide enough for a caravan. The air was warm, scented with ancient wood smoke, wild mint, and something deeper, muskier, that was purely him. He did not set her down. Isabel remained cradled against his chest, her fingers curled instinctively into the solid warmth of his shoulder. Her mind was a fractured kaleidoscope of images. The altar, the knife, the impossible shift from wolf to man, the way he had looked at Arthur, not with rage, but with the weary disdain of a king dismissing a petulant child. She should be terrified. She knew that. Every story ever told about the wolf god was a cautionary tale, a whisper to keep unruly pups in line. He demands blood. He cannot be bargained with. What is given to him is never returned. Yet here she was, being carried deeper into his realm, and the only thing she felt was a strange, disorienting safety. You can speak. His voice rumbled from above her, resonant in the enclosed space. I do not require silence. Isabel swallowed, her throat dry. Where are you taking me? Somewhere you can rest. The simplicity of the answer threw her. She had expected riddles, demands, the cryptic pronouncements of a god, not practicality. The passage opened into a vast chamber, and Isabel forgot to breathe. It was a cavern that seemed to have been shaped by intention rather than nature. A ceiling of obsidian soared overhead, studded with the same glowing crystals that mimicked a starry sky. A pool of dark, steaming water occupied the center, its surface so still it looked like polished jet. Moss, silver and soft as fur, carpeted the floor, and along the far wall, a massive ledge was layered with furs and woven fabrics that must have accumulated over centuries. A hearth, carved directly into the stone, held a fire that burned with low, blue flames, casting dancing shadows across the walls. It was not a lair. It was a sanctuary. He finally set her down, and her bare feet sank into the moss. She swayed, her body still weak from days of deprivation, and his hand shot out to steady her. His grip was firm on her arm, and she felt the latent power thrumming beneath his skin, carefully restrained. You have not eaten, he said. It was not a question. Isabel shook her head. They stopped feeding me 3 days ago. They said the sacrifice had to be purified. Something flickered in his golden eyes, a shadow dark and swift, purified by starvation. Other things. His jaw tightened, and for a moment the temperature in the chamber dropped. She saw then the immense effort it took for him to rein in whatever fury had risen in him. The crystals in the ceiling dimmed, then flared back to full brightness as he exhaled slowly. "Sit," he said, guiding her to the fur-covered ledge. "Do not move," turned and walked toward the shadows at the edge of the chamber. Isabel watched him go, her body sinking into the unexpected softness beneath her. The furs were warm, as if they had been recently occupied, and they smelled of him, ancient forest, winter frost, and the faint sweetness of decay that underlies all wild things. She looked down at her palm. The wound Arthur had carved was gone, leaving only smooth, unmarked skin. She flexed her fingers, testing, and felt no pain. She should be dead. She had made peace with that on the altar. Instead, she was sitting in a god's bed, watching him move through his domain with the quiet efficiency of a creature who had been alone for a very, very long time. He returned with a stone bowl filled with something that steamed gently. He knelt before her, a god kneeling, and pressed it into her hands. She looked down. It was a simple broth, golden and fragrant, with pieces of soft root vegetable floating in it. Her stomach clenched violently at the scent, a desperate animal hunger surging through her. She brought the bowl to her lips and drank, not caring about dignity. He watched her in silence. When she finished, he took the bowl and set it aside, then produced a water skin. She drank from that too, the water cold and sharp as mountain snow. When she was done, she sat back, her body trembling with a sudden influx of sustenance. She felt raw, scraped clean of everything she had been before. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "Why did you take me?" He did not answer immediately. He rose from his kneeling position and moved to sit on the edge of the ledge, a careful distance away. The firelight caught the silver scars on his face, tracing maps of battles older than her entire bloodline. "Do you know what they used to offer me?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the blue flames. "In the beginning, it was intention. A hunter would leave the first kill of winter at the cave mouth, not as a plea, but as gratitude. A mother would sing her child to sleep with songs that honored the wild. There was balance, respect. His voice was low, threaded with a weariness that seemed to press on the very air of the chamber. Over time, that changed. They began to offer for power, a bountiful hunt, a victory in war. They offered livestock, then criminals, then the unwanted, the forgotten. They stopped giving with open hands and started casting out what they wished to discard, and they called it sacrifice. He turned to look at her, and in the firelight, his eyes were not the cold gold she had seen in the clearing. They were warmer, touched with something that might have been sadness. "When you lay on that altar," he said, "you did not pray, you did not curse, you did not beg, you simply looked at me, and in your eyes I saw what I had not seen in 1,000 years. She whispered. Silence, not the silence of fear, the silence of acceptance. You had already made peace with your death. There was no transaction in you, no expectation. You were not giving me anything. You were simply letting go. He reached out and his fingers brushed her wrist. The touch sent a jolt through her, not painful but electric, like the first crack of lightning before a storm. The covenant Arthur invoked was broken the moment he decided your death would buy his salvation. That is not a covenant. That is extortion. And I have no interest in the offerings of cowards who use the innocent as currency. Pulled her wrist back, not out of fear, but because she needed to think clearly, and his touch made that impossible. So you punished them. You took their power. I returned what was never theirs to wield, he corrected. The power they used was borrowed from the old ways, from the bond between wolf and wild. They perverted it, so I called it back. Me, she pressed. What am I, a trophy, a replacement for the sacrifices you're no longer accepting? His expression did not change, but something shifted in the air between them. The fire flickered. The crystals dimmed. You are not a trophy, he said, his voice lower now, edged with something that sounded almost like anger. But it was not anger at her. You are not a pet, you are not a sacrifice. I did not take you to possess you. Then why? He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. Because when I tasted your blood, I felt something I thought had died long before you were born. His heart stuttered. What? He looked at her then, and the weight of his gaze was like standing before an oncoming tide. Immense, inevitable. Life, he said. Not the half-life of waiting, not the stupor of watching centuries pass. Life. Your blood did not taste like fear or desperation. It tasted like beginning. Stood abruptly, moving toward the pool of dark water. He stood at its edge, his back to her, the scars on his shoulders catching the firelight. "You will rest here tonight," he said, his voice returning to its earlier, measured cadence. "Tomorrow we will speak of what comes next. The world outside this cave has changed. Arthur will not accept what happened. He will come for you not because he wants you, but because your existence is proof of his failure." Wrapped her arms around herself. "He has no power now. You said so yourself. Power is not only in blood. It is in desperation, in alliances, in the willingness to do what others will not. Arthur is a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous kind." He turned back to face her, and in the dim light, he looked less like a god and more like a man carrying a burden no one should have to bear alone. "Sleep," he said. "You are safe here. That is the only promise I will make you tonight, but it is one I have never broken." Isabel wanted to ask more. Her mind was a storm of questions, of fears, of the strange, undeniable pull she felt toward this ancient creature who had plucked her from death and called her a beginning. But her body was giving out, the exhaustion of 3 days of deprivation, and a lifetime of being the pack's unwanted finally catching up with her. She lay back on the furs, her head sinking into something impossibly soft. Through heavy eyelids, she watched him move to the far side of the chamber, where a recess in the wall held more furs, a separate space. He was giving her distance, respect, a god who understood consent better than her own Alpha ever had. As sleep pulled her under, she heard his voice one last time, a whisper carried on the strange, warm air of his domain. "Rest, Isabel. Tomorrow I will tell you why your mother tried to take you from this place. And why, in the end, you were the only one who could ever bring me back." She wanted to ask what he meant, but the darkness was already claiming her, and for the first time in her life it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a door finally opening when Isabel woke. She did not know where she was. The panic was immediate, a wild animal clawing at her chest. She sat up too fast, her breath coming in gasps, her hands fisting in the furs beneath her. The stone walls, the glowing crystals, the dark pool, it all crashed back into her memory like a wave, and she pressed a hand to her chest, forcing herself to breathe. She was in the cave. She was alive. The wolf god had taken her, and he was not there. The ledge across the chamber was empty, the furs undisturbed. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. She was alone. Isabel swung her legs over the edge of the ledge, her bare feet finding the moss. She was still wearing the thin shift they had put her in for the sacrifice, the fabric torn at the shoulder, stained with dirt and her own blood. She looked like a corpse brought back to life. She stood on unsteady legs and made her way toward the pool. The water was still dark, and when she knelt at its edge, she saw her reflection. Pale face, dark circles under her eyes, hair tangled and wild, but her eyes were different. There was something in them that hadn't been there before, a spark, a question. She heard movement behind her and turned. He stood at the entrance to the chamber, carrying a bundle in his arms. He had dressed since she last saw him, loose trousers of dark leather, a simple tunic that did nothing to hide the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was pulled back from his face, and in the dim light he looked almost mortal. Almost. He saw her kneeling by the pool and stopped. "You are awake," he said. There was something in his voice she couldn't identify. Relief, perhaps, or surprise. "You left," she said. "I went to retrieve something." He crossed the chamber and set the bundle on the ledge. It was clothing, she realized. A simple dress of dark wool, soft-looking boots, a comb. "Where did you get these?" "There are stores in the deeper caves. Things left by others over the years. I chose what I thought would fit." He paused. "The comb was my mother's." Stared at him. "You had a mother." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was the first time she had seen anything close to humor on his face, and it transformed him, made him less a figure of myth and more a man standing in front of her. "Even gods have beginnings, Isabel. I was not always what I am now." Gestured to the pool. "The water is warm. It will cleanse what they did to you. I will wait outside." Turned to leave, and the words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. "What's your name?" He paused at the threshold, half-turned, his profile carved in shadow and firelight. "I have had many names," he said. "The ancient one, the wolf god, the devourer." A pause. "But before all of that, my mother called me Edward." Left before she could respond, and Isabel sat by the pool, her heart beating a rhythm she didn't recognize. Edward, the wolf god, had a name, and he had given it to her. She undressed and slipped into the water, and as the warmth enveloped her, washing away the dirt and the blood and the memory of the altar, she closed her eyes and let herself, for the first time, consider the possibility that she had not been rescued. She had been claimed, and she was not sure she wanted to be saved. The water was deeper than it looked. Isabel had expected a shallow basin, perhaps waist-high, but when she stepped off the submerged ledge, her feet found no bottom. She gasped, arms flailing for a terrifying moment as the old panic from the altar surged back. The weight of ropes, the cold blade, the pack's hungry eyes. But then her body adjusted. The warm mineral water buoyed her effortlessly, cradling her like something alive and forgiving. Her hair fanned out around her like dark smoke in the gentle current. She let herself drift. The heat seeped into every muscle that had been clenched tight for days, loosening knots she hadn't even known she carried. The water smelled faintly of minerals and something floral, ancient herbs that must have been steeping here for centuries. She closed her eyes and allowed the silence to wrap around her completely. Edward. She tested the name silently in her mind, rolling it across her tongue. It was a solid name. Grounded. Human in a way that made the god who carried it feel strangely closer. Nothing like the grandiose titles the pack had whispered around their fires. The ancient one, the wolf god, the devourer. They had built an entire mythology of fear and reverence around him, and he had let them. Or perhaps, after so many centuries, he had simply stopped caring. She thought again of what he had said the night before. Your blood tasted like beginning. What did that even mean? She was an Omega without a wolf, the unwanted daughter of a traitor. There was nothing beginning about her. She had always been an ending that simply took longer than expected to arrive. And yet she lifted her hand above the water and studied her palm. Where Arthur's ceremonial knife had carved a deep, deliberate gash, the skin was now perfectly smooth. Not even the faintest scar remained. She pressed her fingertips to the spot, testing, and felt only whole, unbroken flesh. The impossibility of it sent a quiet shiver through her. She stayed in the pool until her fingers pruned and the heat made her drowsy. Only then did she climb out, water streaming down her body in rivulets. She reached for the things Edward had left for her. The dress was simple but beautifully made, dark wool that felt soft and warm against her skin. It fell modestly to her ankles with long sleeves that covered her wrists. The boots were lined with soft fur and fit as though they had been made for her. She ran her fingers over the leather, wondering briefly whose feet had worn them before. Another sacrifice, perhaps. Someone else the pack had cast into the cave and never seen again. Then she picked up the comb. It was carved from a single piece of pale wood, the teeth worn smooth from years of use. The handle was shaped like a wolf in mid-leap, stylized yet exquisite. Edward's mother had owned this. She had run it through her hair, perhaps while humming the old songs the pack had long forgotten. The thought made the comb feel heavier in Isabel's hand. Something real, something loved. She sat on the edge of the fur-covered ledge and began working the comb through her tangled hair. The knots were stubborn, matted with dirt and dried blood, but she was patient. Each slow stroke felt like a small act of reclaiming herself, a quiet ritual of putting the pieces back together. When she finished, her hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, cleaner than it had been in months. She felt almost human again. The entrance to the chamber was a wide archway. Beyond it, the glowing passage stretched into shadow. Edward had said he would wait outside, but she had no idea how much time had passed. An hour, 2. Time moved differently here, thick and slow, like honey dripping from a comb. She walked to the archway and peered out. He was sitting against the wall of the passage, long legs stretched out before him, eyes closed. He looked peaceful, but she knew better. A predator like him was never truly asleep. His chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm, and in the soft light of the crystals, the silver scars on his face stood out like quiet rivers of memory. She should let him rest. She should turn around and wait inside. But her feet carried her forward before her mind could stop them. She found herself standing in front of him, her shadow falling gently across his face. His golden eyes opened at once, no grogginess, no disorientation. One moment they were closed, the next they were fixed on her with that piercing, ancient intensity. "You look better," he said, voice low and warm. "You look tired." A faint flicker crossed his face, surprise perhaps that she had noticed. "I do not sleep as humans do." "You didn't sleep at all last night," she replied. It wasn't a question. She had woken several times in the darkness, disoriented and reaching for something she couldn't name, and each time she had seen him sitting in the shadows, watching the fire, watching the entrance, watching over her. "You were observant, even in your exhaustion." "I've spent my whole life being observant. It's how I survived." She wrapped her arms around herself. "When you watch everything, you see the things others miss." He rose in a single fluid motion, suddenly towering over her, all that coiled power held carefully in check. She didn't step back. She had spent her life stepping back, making herself small and invisible. She was done with that. "You said you would tell me about my mother," she said, lifting her chin. "About why she tried to leave." Edward studied her for a long moment, then he inclined his head. "Come, there is something you need to see." Led her deeper into the mountain. The passage sloped downward, the walls narrowing until they walked shoulder to shoulder. The crystals grew thicker, their light poolsing faster, as if the mountain itself breathed in time with some ancient heart. The air turned cooler and drier, and Isabel's breath misted faintly before her face. "Your mother came to this cave 26 years ago," Edward began, his voice echoing softly off the stone. "She was young, barely more than a pup by pack standards, and she was afraid." "My mother was a traitor," Isabel said flatly. "That's what they always told me. She tried to steal me away and they killed her for it." "They told you only what served them." Edward stopped before an ordinary-looking section of wall. He placed his palm against the stone. It shimmered, crystals flared bright, then dimmed to reveal a narrow hidden crevice. "Your mother came to me because she knew what Arthur was becoming. She begged for protection for you." He stepped inside, and Isabel followed. The pocket chamber was small, no larger than a closet, but far from empty. In the center stood a natural stone pedestal holding a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. The walls were covered in elegant carvings, symbols spiraling with precision and care, patterns that seemed to shift just beyond the edge of vision. At the heart of every spiral was a single name, Mara, her mother's name, repeated again and again, woven like threads in a living tapestry. "She came to me when she discovered she was pregnant with you," Edward said, his voice softer now. "She knew what Arthur would do if he learned the truth. A child of her bloodline, the last descendant of the old priesthood, would be seen as a weapon. He would have used you, Isabel, shaped you into a tool for his ambition." Isabel turned from the walls, staring at him. "My mother was an Omega. She was nobody. She was everything." Edward moved to the pedestal and touched the bundle with surprising gentleness. "Your mother's bloodline was the last to remember the old ways. They kept the true covenant, the balance between pack and wild. Arthur's grandfather slaughtered them when he seized power. He spared only your mother because she was too young to threaten him. He kept her alive as a servant, a living reminder of his victory." His hands trembled. She pressed them against her thighs to steady them. "That's not what they told me." "Of course not. Arthur could never admit his power was built on genocide. He needed you to believe you were worthless. Worthless people don't rebel. They accept the altar." She thought of her childhood, the cold glances, the whispers, the way the other pups were taught to shun her. She had internalized every slight, building her entire identity around being the least of the least. It had been survival. If she was nothing, she couldn't be a threat. If she wasn't a threat, she might be overlooked. Overlooked meant she stayed alive, but her mother had wanted more for her than mere survival. "She ran," Isabel said, voice cracking. "She tried to take me away. They caught her at the border and executed her in front of me." Edward's jaw tightened. "I know. I felt the moment her life ended, the last thread of the old covenant snapping. After that, I fell into deep sleep. There was nothing left worth watching over." Unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a cracked leather journal and a small silver pendant shaped like a wolf's head, its eyes tiny gemstones that caught the crystal light and reflected it back in warm amber and gold. "Your mother left these the night she came," Edward said. "She asked me to keep them safe. She said I would know when the time was right to give them to you." Reached out, fingers hovering over the pendant. She knew she was going to die. She knew the risk. Arthur had discovered her lineage and planned to breed her to his strongest warriors to create a controllable line of priests. She ran to save you from that fate, and she came to me because she hoped. He paused, golden eyes meeting hers. She hoped one day her daughter would not need to run. Picked up the pendant. It felt warm, as if it had been waiting. She slipped the chain over her head. The wolf's head settled against her chest, just above her heart. A sudden pulse of heat flared through her, not painful but startling. It spread down her arms, through her ribs, pooling deep in her core. She gasped, hand flying to the pendant. When she looked up, Edward was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "What was that?" she whispered. "Recognition," he said. "That pendant belonged to the high priestess of the old covenant for generations. It carries the last ember of the old magic, the magic that was always meant to be yours." Shook her head. Stumbling back a step. "I don't have magic, I don't have anything, I'm wolfless. You are Mara's daughter." Edward stepped closer. She stopped retreating, there was nowhere left to go. You are not wolfless, Isabel. You are something older, something your pack forgot existed because they destroyed the ones who remembered. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, the same electric jolt she remembered from the night before passed between them. The old covenant was never only about wolves, he continued. It was about balance. Wolves were the guardians, but the priests were the heart. They spoke for the wild and reminded everyone what was being protected. When Arthur's grandfather destroyed the priesthood, he broke the covenant. The power your pack has wielded for 60 years was never borrowed. It was stolen. And without the priesthood to balance it, that power has been corrupting them from within. Wasting sickness in the pups, the rogues at the borders, those are not curses, they are consequences. Isabel stared at him. So if the priesthood had survived, none of this would have happened. Systems built on theft and murder do not endure, Edward said simply. Arthur's pack has been consuming itself for decades. The altar was their final desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. They offered a sacrifice not out of belief but out of fear, and fear makes very poor currency. Released her hand. She felt the absence of his touch like a physical loss. What am I supposed to do with all of this? She asked, gesturing to the pendant, the journal, the walls covered in her mother's name. I'm not a priestess. I don't know anything about magic or covenants. You learn. The simplicity of his answer silenced her. He spoke as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I don't even know what I am, she said, voice small. Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real smile that softened the sharp lines of his face and made him look suddenly younger. Your mother was the most powerful priestess in a generation, he said. She hid her strength for years, letting everyone believe she was nothing because that was the only way to survive. You have done the same, but you are not small, Isabel. You are not invisible, and you are not wolfless. Reached out and touched the pendant resting against her chest. The heat flared again, stronger this time. She felt something stir deep inside her, a quiet presence, a voice that had been waiting. You have been sleeping, Edward said, golden eyes holding hers. It is time to wake up. She spent the rest of the day in the small priestess chamber, reading her mother's journal by the soft glow of the crystals. The final entry was written directly to her. My dearest Isabel, if you are reading this, I am gone. Do not mourn me. I chose this path so you could have a future. Arthur would have made you a weapon or a broodmare. I could not allow that. You are not what they say. You are not wolfless. The wolf is only half the covenant. The heart is the other half, and that heart beats in you. It beat in me and in my mother before me all the way back to the first priestess. The power you carry is not a curse. It is a responsibility. One day, when you are ready, you will feel it. It will not be a wolf that answers. It will be something older, something wilder. Be brave, be kind. Be the thing they cannot name. I love you. I have always loved you. Your mother, Mara Isabel, closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. She did not cry, she had spent those tears long ago, but something tight inside her finally loosened. She was not worthless. She was not a mistake. She was her mother's daughter, loved enough to die for. When the crystals began to dim, signaling night, she gathered the journal and returned to the main chamber, the pendant still warm against her skin. Edward stood by the pool, his back to her. He didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders relax slightly as if he had been waiting. I read her journal, Isabel said, voice steadier than she felt. Walked to his side and looked at their reflections in the dark water. He was ancient, scarred, and impossibly powerful. She was small, human, and beginning to realize she was something else entirely. She said I would have a voice. You always had one, Edward said quietly. You simply chose not to use it. I chose to survive. Now, Isabel met her own reflection. The woman staring back had her mother's eyes. Now, she said, I want to do more than survive. Edward turned to face her, golden eyes luminous in the dim light. What do you want, Isabel? She thought of the altar, the knife, the calm acceptance she had felt looking into the cave. She had been ready to die. Instead, she was here, beside a god who had given her back her mother's words and a warmth that felt like home. I want to know what I am, she said. I want to know what I can become. And I want Arthur to know that the girl he put on that altar is the one who will tear down everything he built. Something shifted in the air between them. The crystals flared brighter for a moment, and the pendant pulsed an answer. You will need to learn, Edward said. The old ways demand discipline and sacrifice. I've spent my whole life being uncomfortable with myself, she replied. I think I can handle a few lessons. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. We begin at dawn. He turned toward his side of the chamber. Isabel felt the sudden urge to call him back, but she held her tongue. He had given her space. She would offer the same. She lay down on the furs, pendant warm against her chest, journal tucked beside her. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like she was waiting for an ending. She felt like she was waiting for something to begin. And in the quiet darkness, she heard Edward humming a low, unfamiliar melody, an old song from before the covenant broke. A song her mother might once have sung. She closed her eyes and let it carry her into sleep in the world above. The pack had descended into chaos. Without the stolen power of the covenant, hierarchy collapsed. Betas challenged alphas. Omegas fled into the forest. Old bonds dissolved like mist. Arthur stood at the edge of the clearing, fists clenched, staring at the dark mouth of the cave. The god took her, Olivia hissed, face pale with fury. He took our sacrifice and our power. What do we do now? Arthur did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the cave where Isabel and the wolf god had vanished. He had thought she was nothing, a wolf-less Omega fit only for the altar. But the god had looked at her and seen something Arthur had missed for 26 years. We get her back, he said at last, voice low and cold. We get her back, learn what the god sees in her, and then we use it. Olivia frowned. How? We have no power left. The wolves are tearing each other apart. The rogues are closing in. Arthur turned to her. The look in his eyes made her step back. Gone was the confident alpha, only raw desperation remained. The old covenant is broken, he said. But there are other powers in this world, older, darker, powers that do not need a priestess. Looked back at the cave, remembering Isabel's calm silence on the altar. You can be alpha of a dying pack, he murmured. Or you can help me build something new. Walked away, leaving Olivia alone in the moonlight. Behind him, the pack howled and fought. But Arthur's mind was already turning to the next sacrifice. Isabel thought she was safe with her god. Arthur had spent his life taking what was not his. He was not about to stop now. Dawn in the mountain was not a thing of light. Isabel woke to silence, the crystals in the ceiling pulsing with a soft, amber glow that mimicked the first light of sunrise. There was no sun here, no sky, no horizon, only the slow brightening of the ancient stones, as if the mountain itself was waking alongside her. She lay still for a moment, her hand pressed to the pendant on her chest. It was warm, as always, and she could feel a faint rhythm beneath her fingers, like a heartbeat that was not her own. Her mother's heartbeat, perhaps. Or something older. Across the chamber, the furs where Edward had slept were empty, neatly folded. He was already awake, already waiting. She rose and dressed quickly, pulling on the wool dress and the fur-lined boots. She ran the wolf-carved comb through her hair, working out the tangles that had formed overnight, and then she stood at the edge of the pool, looking at her reflection. The woman who looked back at her was still pale, still thin, still carrying the shadows of her former life in the hollows of her cheeks. But there was something different in her eyes, a steadiness, a purpose. She touched the pendant one last time, then turned and walked toward the passage. She found Edward in a chamber she had not seen before. It was smaller than the main chamber, more intimate, its walls lined with shelves carved directly into the stone. The shelves held things she did not recognize, bundles of dried herbs, small clay vessels, bundles of parchment, objects of bone and wood and stone that seemed to pulse with a quiet, waiting energy. A fire burned in a central hearth, its flames blue-green, and in the center of the room a circle had been carved into the stone floor, its lines filled with something that glittered like crushed starlight. Edward stood at the edge of the circle, his arms crossed over his chest. He was dressed simply today, dark trousers, a linen shirt that stretched across his shoulders, and his hair was pulled back from his face. In the firelight, the scars on his face looked less like wounds and more like maps, paths he had traveled across the centuries. You came, he said. You said we begin at dawn. He inclined his head. So I did. He gestured to the circle, and Isabel stepped forward, her boots touching the edge of the carved lines. A shiver went through her, not of cold, but of recognition. The circle knew her, or perhaps it knew the pendant she wore. This is the first circle, Edward said. It is where the old priestesses came to remember. Remember what? Everything. He moved to stand across from her, the circle between them. The covenant was not a contract written on paper. It was a memory, carried in blood and bone and breath. The priestesses did not learn the old ways from books. They remembered them. The magic was already there, sleeping in their veins. They only needed to wake it. Isabel looked down at the circle. The crushed starlight glittered up at her, and she felt the pendant pulse in response. You want me to remember something I never knew. I want you to stop pretending you don't already know it. She met his eyes. What if I don't know anything? What if I'm just a girl from a pack that hated her, wearing her dead mother's necklace, standing in a cave with a god who... She stopped, her voice catching. Edward waited. He did not fill the silence. He simply stood there, patient as stone, his golden eyes fixed on her. "A god who what?" he asked when it became clear she would not finish. Isabel shook her head. "A god who I don't understand. You took me from the altar. You gave me my mother's journal. You're standing here trying to teach me something I don't know if I can learn. But you haven't told me why. Not really. You said my blood tasted like beginning. What does that mean?" Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped into the circle. The moment his foot touched the crushed starlight, the chamber changed. The flames in the hearth flared, turning from blue-green to pure white. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and Isabel felt a pressure building in the air, a weight that pressed against her chest and made her ears ring. Edward walked toward her, and with each step the light grew brighter, the pressure stronger. By the time he stood before her, she could barely breathe. "You want to know what I saw when I tasted your blood," he said, his voice low, resonant, vibrating through her bones. "I saw a thread. A single, golden thread, stretching back through the centuries, through the slaughter of your mother's bloodline, through the fall of the old covenant, through everything that was broken and lost. And at the end of that thread there was you." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers cool against her cheek. "You are not the end of something, Isabel. You are the continuation. The last priestess did not die with your mother. She was waiting, sleeping. And when your blood touched my lips, I knew that the thread had not been broken. It had only been hidden, until now." He dropped his hand and stepped back. The light in the chamber dimmed, the pressure eased, and Isabel found she could breathe again. "Now," he said, his voice returning to its normal cadence, "we begin." The first lesson was silence. Edward led her to the center of the circle and told her to sit. She sat cross-legged on the cold stone, the pendant warm against her chest, and he sat across from her, his legs folded, his hands resting on his knees. "Priestesses listened," he said. "They did not command, they did not demand. They listened to the wild, and the wild listened to them. But first they had to learn to hear." He closed his eyes, and after a moment Isabel closed hers as well. For a long time there was nothing. The darkness behind her eyes was complete, the silence of the chamber absolute. She sat there, her breath slow and even, and waited, and waited, and waited. Her mind began to wander. She thought of Arthur, of the rage in his face when Edward had carried her away. She thought of Olivia's smug smile, the way she had watched Isabel being led to the altar as if it were a celebration. She thought of her mother, of the journal pressed against her chest, of the words her mother had written. "You have always had a voice, you just never knew how to use it." "Hear nothing," she said, opening her eyes. Edward's eyes were already open, watching her. "You are thinking." "Of course I'm thinking." "You asked me to sit in silence. That's not nothing, that's—" She stopped, frustrated. "That is the first lesson," he said. "Your mind is a wall. You have spent your life building it, brick by brick, to protect yourself. It served you well. But now you must learn to let it fall." Smiled slightly. "That is the second lesson." He rose and walked to one of the shelves, selecting a small clay vessel. He brought it back to the circle and knelt beside her, removing the lid. Inside was a paste of some kind, dark green, smelling of earth and something sharp, like crushed pine needles. "This is a remembering salve," he said. "My mother made it. She used it to prepare the young priestesses for their first listening." He dipped his fingers into the salve, and before Isabel could ask what he was doing, he reached out and pressed his fingertips to her forehead. The touch was cool, then warm, then hot. The scent of pine and earth filled her nostrils, overwhelming, and suddenly she was not in the chamber anymore. She was standing in a forest. Not the forest she knew, the one surrounding Arthur's territory, but something older. The trees were massive, their trunks wider than houses, their branches so high they disappeared into a canopy of green-gold light. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming flowers, and beneath it all, a deep, resonant hum, like the breathing of something vast and ancient. She looked down at her hands. They were her hands, but different. Older, marked with lines she did not recognize. Listen, the word came from everywhere and nowhere. It was not Edward's voice. It was the voice of the forest itself, the hum given shape. Isabel closed her eyes and listened, and this time she heard. It was not a sound, not exactly. It was a feeling, a knowledge. She could feel the roots of the trees beneath her feet, spreading through the earth, connecting to other roots, other trees, an entire network of life that stretched for miles. She could feel the animals, the deer moving through the underbrush, the birds nesting in the high branches, the insects swarming in the damp soil. She could feel the water deep underground, moving in slow, dark rivers toward places she could not name. And beneath all of it, she could feel something watching, something vast and patient and old. something that had been waiting for her. She opened her eyes and the forest was gone. She was back in the chamber, sitting in the circle with Edward kneeling before her. His hand was still on her forehead, and when he pulled it away, she saw that the salve had left a mark, a spiral like the ones on her mother's walls, glowing faintly on her skin. "You heard," he said. It was not a question. Isabel's breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. "What was that?" "The wild. The old thing that was here before wolves, before packs, before anything. It has been waiting for someone to listen. Your mother heard it, her mother heard it, and now you hear it." Isabel touched her forehead, her fingers finding the spiral. It was warm, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. "It said something, not in words, but I felt." She struggled to find the words. "It felt like it was asking something." Edward's expression shifted, something flickering in his golden eyes. "What did it ask?" She closed her eyes, trying to hold onto the feeling. "It asked if I was ready." "What did you answer?" She opened her eyes and looked at him. "I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say." Edward sat back on his heels, and for a moment he looked almost human, tired, hopeful, afraid. "That is the right answer," he said quietly. "The wild does not want blind promises, it wants truth. And the truth is, you are not ready, not yet, but you are willing to become ready." "That is enough." He rose and offered her his hand. She took it and he pulled her to her feet. The spiral on her forehead pulsed once, then faded, becoming invisible to the eye but not, she knew, gone. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you rest. The first listening is exhausting. Your body needs time to adjust." "Not tired." Even as she said it, a wave of exhaustion crashed over her. Her knees buckled and Edward caught her, his arms wrapping around her before she could fall. She was pressed against his chest, her face against the linen of his shirt, and she could feel his heartbeat, slow, steady, ancient. "You were saying." His voice was dry, but there was warmth beneath it. She wanted to push back, to insist she was fine, but her body would not cooperate. The exhaustion was too deep, too complete. It was as if the forest had reached into her and taken something, leaving behind a hollow that would need time to fill. "Fine," she mumbled against his shirt. "Maybe a little tired." She felt more than heard his laugh, a low rumble in his chest. Then he was lifting her, cradling her against him as he had done the night of the sacrifice, and carrying her back toward the main chamber. "Rest," he said as he laid her on the furs. "When you wake, we will speak more of what you heard." She wanted to argue, but her eyes were already closing. The last thing she saw was Edward sitting beside her, his back against the wall, his golden eyes watching her with an expression she could not name. She slept when she woke. The crystals were pulsing with the amber light of late afternoon. She was alone in the chamber, but there was food beside her, bread, cheese, a cup of water, and a note written on a scrap of parchment in a hand that was old, elegant, unfamiliar. "Gone to attend to the boarders. Do not leave the cave." Isabel ate slowly, her body still heavy with the remnants of sleep. The spiral on her forehead was gone, but she could still feel it, a faint warmth beneath her skin, a door that had been opened and not yet closed. She thought about what she had heard in the forest, the hum beneath everything, the vast, patient presence that had asked if she was ready. She had not answered, but the question had changed something in her. The hollow it had left behind was not empty. It was waiting. She finished her meal and rose, moving toward the passage. She did not intend to leave the cave. Edward's warning was clear. But she needed to move, to walk, to think. She wandered through the passages, letting the crystal light guide her. She passed the chamber of the priestesses, the walls still covered in her mother's spirals. She passed other chambers she had not seen before, one filled with weapons so old they had turned to rust, another with a pool of water so clear it looked like glass, another with a ceiling so high she could not see the top. She was in a passage she did not recognize when she heard it, a voice. Faint, distant, carried on the stone, she stopped, her heart suddenly pounding. The voice was not Edward's. It was not the hum of the wild. It was human, and it was coming from somewhere ahead. She should go back. She knew she should go back, but her feet carried her forward, drawn by something she could not name. The passage opened into a small chamber, and in the center of the chamber, a pool of water lay still and dark. And in the water, she saw Arthur. He was standing in a forest, the same forest she had visited in her vision, but it was night there. Torches flickered around him, casting shadows across his face. Behind him, Olivia stood with her arms crossed, and Wesley held a torch aloft. But there was someone else. A figure in a dark cloak, their face hidden, their hands raised toward the sky. Isabel watched, frozen, as Arthur spoke. "God has taken what is mine. He has broken the covenant and left my pack to rot. But I will not bow, I will not beg. I will take back what was stolen, and I will take more besides." The cloaked figure lowered their hands and a voice emerged from the shadows, a woman's voice, cold and amused. You speak boldly for a man who has lost everything. I have lost nothing, Arthur snarled. I am still Alpha, I still have my wolves, and I have you. Figure laughed, a sound like breaking ice. You have me because you came to me. Because your precious wolf god would not give you what you wanted, and now you want my help to take from him. I want the girl, Arthur said. She is the key. The god saw something in her and I want to know what it is. And when I know, his face twisted into something ugly, something hungry. When I know I will use it, I will become something greater than the wolf god, greater than any covenant. I will become a god killer, the figure finished. How ambitious. Arthur's eyes gleamed in the torchlight. Will you help me or not? The figure stepped forward and for a moment Isabel saw her face. Pale, beautiful, with eyes that were black as pitch and a smile that held no warmth. I will help you, the woman said. But not for free. When you take the girl, she is mine first. I want to see what the wolf god found so precious. I want to taste it for myself. Arthur hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. Woman smiled, and in the pool of water the vision began to ripple, to fade. But before it disappeared, she looked up directly at Isabel and her smile widened. You are watching, she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. Good, watch closely, little priestess. Your god cannot protect you from what is coming. Water went still, and the vision was gone. Isabel stood in the darkness, her hands shaking, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Arthur was coming. He had found someone, something to help him. And that woman had seen her, had spoken to her. She turned and ran. She did not know the passages, did not know which way led back to the main chamber, but her feet seemed to know the way, carrying her through the labyrinth as if she had walked it 100 times. The crystals flared as she passed, lighting her path, and she did not stop until she burst into the main chamber and found Edward standing by the pool. He turned when she entered, and his face shifted from calm to alert in an instant. What happened? Arthur, she gasped. He's coming, he's found someone, a woman. She stopped, struggling to find the words. I saw them in a pool of water in one of the chambers. They're coming for me. Edward's expression did not change, but the temperature in the chamber dropped. The crystals dimmed and the fire in the hearth guttered, flaring blue. You saw a vision, he said. In the scrying pool. I didn't know what it was. I was walking and I heard a voice and I followed it and I saw. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the pendant pound against her palm. She saw me, Edward. She looked at me and spoke to me. He crossed the chamber in 3 long strides and took her by the shoulders, his grip firm but not painful. What did she say? Isabel swallowed. She said you couldn't protect me. She said she wanted to see what you found precious. She wanted to taste it. Edward's jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than the vision had. Fear, the wolf god, afraid. Who is she? Isabel whispered. He released her and stepped back, running a hand through his hair. Her name is Charlotte. Isabel blinked. Charlotte, the pack healer. Charlotte was never a healer, Edward said, his voice hard. She was something that attached itself to your pack generations ago, feeding on the corruption Arthur's grandfather created. She has been waiting, watching. And now, with the covenant broken and the pack in chaos, she sees an opportunity. What is she? Edward looked at her, and in his golden eyes she saw the weight of centuries. She is what happens when the old magic is perverted. When the wild is silenced, something else grows in its place. Something hungry. Something that does not want balance. It wants consumption. He turned away, moving toward the weapons chamber. You should not have seen that vision. The scrying pool is dangerous. It shows what is, but also what could be. And sometimes it shows what the darkness wants you to see. Isabel followed him. It showed the truth. Arthur is coming. That woman Charlotte, she is helping him. She wants me. Edward stopped at the entrance to the weapons chamber, his hand on the stone frame. He did not turn around. She wants what you carry, he said quietly. The bloodline, the pendant, the last ember of the old covenant. If she takes it, she will use it to unmake everything that remains of the old ways. She will become something that even I cannot fight. Isabel's blood ran cold. Then what do we do? He turned to face her, and in the dim light, he looked less like a god and more like a man preparing for a battle he did not know he could win. We prepare, he said, and we hope that the wild remembers you as clearly as you remember it. He reached out and touched the pendant on her chest. The warmth flared, and she felt the forest again, the hum beneath everything, the vast, patient presence that had asked if she was ready. This time she had an answer. I'm ready, she said. Not yet, but I will be. Edward's hand closed over the pendant, and for a moment his golden eyes held hers. Then let us begin again. he said outside, in the forest. Charlotte stood at the edge of the clearing, her black eyes fixed on the mountain. Behind her, Arthur's pack, what remained of it, waited. They were ragged, desperate, their wolves barely contained beneath their skin. But they were loyal. Fear would do that. Charlotte had spent generations cultivating their fear, feeding on it, shaping them into something she could use. And now, finally, she would have her reward. The wolf god had awakened. The last priestess had been found. And in the mountain, something old and powerful was stirring. Charlotte smiled. She had waited a long time for this. The old covenant had kept her contained, kept her feeding on scraps, kept her weak. But with the covenant broken and the priestess unprotected, she would finally have what she needed to become whole. She raised her hand, and the pack stirred behind her. "Tonight," she said, her voice carrying on the wind, "we take back what was stolen." Wolves howled, and Charlotte laughed, and the forest fell silent around her. The hunt had begun. The mountain prepared for war. Isabel watched Edward move through the chambers with the efficiency of a creature who had been defending this place for millennia. He did not rush. He did not panic. He simply gathered what he needed: weapons from the rusted chamber that gleamed with new sharpness at his touch, herbs from the shelves that he crushed into powders and salves, stones from the deepest caves that pulsed with a light that made her eyes water. She followed him, helping where she could, but mostly she watched. She was learning. Not the magic yet, not the deep listening that would make her a priestess, but something else. She was learning him. Edward was not a god in the way the stories told. He was not omnipotent, not all-seeing, not untouchable. He was old, yes, and powerful, but his power had limits. It had been waning for centuries, fed by a covenant that had been broken long before Arthur made his final, desperate sacrifice. He had been sleeping when she arrived, sleeping and waiting for something he could not name. He had named it now, her. "Charlotte will not come alone," Edward said, laying out a series of knives on a stone table. They were obsidian, their edges so fine they seemed to vanish when she looked at them directly. "She has spent generations weaving herself into your pack. They are hers now, whether they know it or not." Isabel picked up one of the knives, testing its weight. It was lighter than she expected, balanced perfectly. "Can they be saved?" Edward paused, looking at her. In the dim light of the weapon's chamber, his golden eyes seemed to glow. "You want to save them. They were my pack. They called me worthless, put me on an altar, watched me bleed. And still," she set the knife down, her hand trembling slightly, "and still they are wolves. They are what Arthur and Charlotte made them, but they were something else before." Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up a knife of his own, sliding it into a sheath at his hip. The old covenant was not only about power. It was about choice. The wolves chose to protect. The priestesses chose to listen. When choice is taken away, there is no covenant, only chains. He turned to face her fully. "If Charlotte falls, her hold on them will break. They will be free to choose again, what they choose." He shrugged, a surprisingly human gesture. "That is not for me to decide." Isabel nodded slowly. "Then we make her fall." A ghost of a smile touched Edward's lips. "Yes." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Edward taught her how to apply the salves he had made, the ones that would mask their scent from Charlotte's wolves. He taught her the paths through the mountain, the hidden passages that only the priestesses had known. He showed her the deep caves where the crystals grew so thick that the light was blinding, and the narrow crevices where the mountain itself would protect her if she asked. "The mountain remembers your mother," he said, pressing his palm to a wall of obsidian that reflected no light. "It will remember you if you let it." Isabel placed her hand beside his. The stone was cold at first, then warm enough that she had to pull away. When she looked at her palm, she saw the spiral again, faint but visible, etched into her skin. "Mark of the priestess," Edward said. "It will fade when you are ready to receive it fully." "If I'm never ready." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made her chest tighten. "You are already more ready than you know." Night fell outside, though inside the mountain there was only the constant pulse of the crystals. Isabel sat in the main chamber, her mother's journal open on her lap, her fingers tracing the looping script she had come to know so well. The wild does not ask for perfection, her mother had written. It asks for presence. To be present is to be powerful. To be present is to be alive. The wolves hunt, the priestesses listen, and the world turns. Do not try to control what cannot be controlled. Do not try to hold what must be free. Be present. Be open. Be the breath between one moment and the next. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, the pendant warm between them. She could feel the forest now, even here deep in the mountain. The hum was faint but constant, a thread connecting her to something vast and ancient. She had been silent her whole life, but that silence had been a wall, a protection, a hiding place. Now she was learning a different silence, The silence of listening. The silence of being present. Edward appeared at the entrance to the chamber, his silhouette dark against the glowing passage. They are coming. Isabel rose, setting the journal aside. She did not feel fear, not the sharp, choking fear she had felt on the altar. There was something else in her chest, something that felt almost like calm. How many? All of them. Arthur, Olivia, Wesley, the pack, and Charlotte. Isabel nodded. She had known they would come. The vision had shown her, and she had chosen to believe it. What is the plan? Edward moved to stand beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. You stay here in this chamber. The mountain will protect you. I will go to the entrance and... No, he turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his features. Isabel, not staying here while you fight them alone. She met his golden eyes, and she did not look away. I've spent my whole life staying where I was told, hiding, making myself small. I'm done. This is not about hiding. Charlotte wants you. If she gets past me, then she won't get past you. Isabel stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to see the individual scars that marked his face. You are the wolf god. You are the one who ended a covenant with a word. You are the one who carried me out of that clearing and called me a beginning. I am not hiding from this. Edward's jaw tightened. You do not know what she is capable of. You don't know what I'm capable of. She touched the pendant on her chest. I heard the wild Edward. I felt it. It asked if I was ready, and I said not yet, but I meant... She took a breath. I meant that I was willing to become ready. That was the truth. And the truth is I am ready now, not because I have power, not because I understand everything, but because I am done running. Something shifted in Edward's expression. The tension in his jaw eased, and the golden light in his eyes seemed to soften. You are your mother's daughter, he said quietly. And more than that. She took his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. I am what comes after, the continuation. He looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment he seemed almost human, almost young. If we do this together, you stay behind me. You do not engage Charlotte directly. Her power is old, older than your pack, older than this mountain. It is. Corruption, Isabel finished. I know, I felt it in the vision. She's not like you. You are old, but you are still connected to the wild. She is something else, something that feeds. Edward's grip on her hand tightened. How do you know that? She smiled, and it was not a soft smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, only to discover she was everything. Because I listened. They met Charlotte at the entrance to the cave. The clearing outside was full of wolves, their eyes gleaming in the torchlight. Their bodies tense with the desperate energy of creatures who had nothing left to lose. Arthur stood at the front, his face a mask of fury, and beside him, Olivia held a torch that cast dancing shadows across the trees. But Isabel did not look at them. She looked at Charlotte. The pack healer stood apart from the others, her cloak billowing in a wind that touched nothing else. Her black eyes were fixed on Isabel, and her smile was the smile of a predator who had found its prey. Little priestess comes out to play, Charlotte said, her voice carrying across the clearing. I was beginning to think your god would keep you hidden forever. Edward stepped forward, positioning himself between Isabel and Charlotte. You are not welcome here. The mountain remembers what you are. The mountain remembers many things. Charlotte's smile did not waver. It remembers your mother, Edward. It remembers the covenant she made. It remembers the day your father died and you became something you were never meant to be. Isabel saw Edward's shoulders stiffen, but he did not respond. He simply stood, a wall of power between her and the darkness. Arthur, Edward said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. This is your last chance. Call off your wolves. Take what remains of your pack and go. I will not harm you if you leave now. Arthur laughed, a harsh, broken sound. My pack, you took my pack, you took my power. You took the girl that was supposed to be mine. He pointed at Isabel, his hand shaking. She was the sacrifice, she was the payment, and you stole her. I took nothing that was yours to give. Edward's voice was cold now, cold as the deepest caves. You offered her in fear, you offered her in desperation, and you offered her without understanding what she was. That is not a covenant, that is a crime. Arthur's face twisted. I am the alpha, I decide what is mine, I decide. You decide nothing. Edward raised his hand, and a pulse of power rippled through the clearing. The wolves behind Arthur whimpered, some of them dropping to their knees. You are not an alpha. You are a thief who stole power that was never meant for you. And now that power is gone. Charlotte laughed, the sound slicing through the tension. Gone? Oh no, wolf god, not gone, just transformed. She raised her own hand, and black light erupted from her fingers, spreading through the clearing like spilled ink. The wolves who had been cowering rose, their eyes turning black, their bodies twisting with power that was not their own. Charlotte, Edward warned. Do not do this. What? Charlotte's smile widened. Give them what they always wanted, power, purpose. You left them empty, Edward. I am filling them. Wolves began to shift, but not into the wolves they had been. Their forms twisted, elongated, their fur turning to shadow, their eyes burning with black fire. They were becoming something else. Something that had no place in the wild. Isabel felt the pendant pulse against her chest, hot and urgent. The hum of the forest, the wild that she had heard in her vision, rose in her ears, drowning out the sounds of the clearing. Listen, it said. Listen and speak. She stepped out from behind Edward. Isabel, no. He reached for her, but she moved past him, walking toward Charlotte with a calm she did not feel. Little priestess, Charlotte purred. Come to give yourself to me? How generous. Isabel stopped 10 feet from her. Behind Charlotte, the corrupted wolves were advancing, their black eyes fixed on her, their mouths dripping shadow. Not giving myself to anyone, Isabel said. Her voice was steady, stronger than she felt. I came to tell you something. Charlotte tilted her head, amusement flickering in her black eyes. Oh, and what is that? Isabel reached up and pulled the pendant from her chest. The chain broke easily, too easily, as if it had been waiting for her to remove it. The wolf's head sat in her palm, warm and pulsing, and she could feel the last ember of the old covenant burning within it. You said you wanted to taste what the wolf god found precious, Isabel said. You wanted to see why he chose me over your pack. Charlotte's smile faltered just for a moment. Yes, Isabel closed her fingers around the pendant. Then taste this. She opened her hand and blew. The ember that had been sleeping in the pendant for 26 years flared to life. It was not fire. It was not light. It was the memory of the old covenant, the sound of the wild, the voice of the priestesses who had been silenced for generations. It was her mother's voice, and her mother's mother's voice, and all the voices that had been lost when Arthur's grandfather slaughtered the priesthood. It was the beginning. The ember flew from her palm, a spark of gold in the darkness, and it struck Charlotte in the chest. The healer screamed. The sound was not human. It was the scream of something old and corrupted, something that had been feeding on fear and desperation for centuries. The black light around her fractured, shattering like glass, and the wolves behind her convulsed, the shadow forms falling away as they collapsed to the ground. Charlotte stumbled back, her hands clawing at her chest where the ember had lodged itself. What have you done? Isabel stood where she was, her hand still outstretched, the pendant now dark and cold in her other hand. I woke up. Ember inside Charlotte blazed, and the corruption that had been woven into her for centuries began to burn away. She screamed again, her form flickering, shifting, revealing something beneath, something small and gray and ancient, a creature that had once been part of the wild before it had turned to darkness. Edward was beside Isabel in an instant, his hand closing around hers. Now, he said, call it back. I don't know how. Yes, you do. His golden eyes met hers. You have always known. You just never used your voice. Isabel looked at the creature that had been Charlotte, writhing in the clearing, the ember burning within her. She felt the wild humming in her ears, felt the mountain pressing against her back, felt her mother's presence in the pendant against her palm. She closed her eyes and listened. And then she spoke. It was not words. It was not a command. It was a song, old and formless, the song that the first priestess had sung when she walked the wild with the first wolf. It was the song of beginning, of balance, of the covenant that had been broken and was now, at last, being remade. The ember in Charlotte's chest flared one last time, and then it rose, a thread of gold against the darkness, and flew back to Isabel. It settled in her chest, just below her heart, and she felt something click into place. Something that had been missing her whole life. She opened her eyes. Charlotte was gone. In her place was a small, gray wolf, its eyes no longer black but a soft, amber gold. It looked at Isabel for a moment, something ancient and weary in its gaze, and then it turned and disappeared into the forest. The clearing was silent. Arthur lay on the ground, his wolves scattered around him, their corrupted forms gone, their natural wolves returned but weak, confused. Olivia was curled at the edge of the clearing, her face buried in her hands. Wesley stood frozen, his torch extinguished, staring at Isabel with an expression she could not read. Isabel stood in the center of it all, the pendant cold in her hand, the ember warm in her chest. She was trembling, she realized, shaking from head to foot. Edward's hand was on her shoulder, steadying her. You did it. She looked up at him. I don't feel like I did anything. You sang the wild back into balance. His voice was low, meant only for her. You remade the covenant. The first priestess has returned. Isabel shook her head. I'm not a priestess. You are Isabel, Edward said. Daughter of Mara, last of the old bloodline, the one who was sacrificed and refused to die, the one who listened when the wild called. His hand moved from her shoulder to her face, his fingers brushing her cheek. You are the beginning I tasted in your blood, and now you are the continuation. She leaned into his touch, too exhausted to do anything else. What happens now? Edward looked out at the clearing, at the scattered wolves, at the forest that was slowly, quietly returning to itself. Now they choose. The covenant is remade, but it does not bind them. It never did. They are free to return to the old ways or to walk away. The choice is theirs. Us? He looked down at her, and in his golden eyes she saw something she had not expected. Not the coldness of a god, not the weariness of an ancient being. Something warm. Something that had been waiting for her for a very long time. Covenant was between the wolves and the wild, he said. But it was also between the wolf god and the priestess. I have been alone for a long time, Isabel, watching, waiting. Sleeping. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. I do not wish to be alone anymore. Isabel's heart stuttered in her chest. I don't know how to be a priestess. I don't know how to be anything yet. Then we learn together. He smiled, and it was the real smile, the one that softened his face and made him look almost mortal. You are not the end of something, Isabel. You are the beginning, and beginnings take time. She looked at him, this ancient god who had pulled her from an altar and called her precious. She looked at the forest, where the wild was humming a new song, a song that she could hear now always, a thread connecting her to everything that was and everything that would be, and she smiled. "'Kay," she said. "We learned together." In the weeks that followed, the pack slowly rebuilt. Arthur was gone. He had fled into the forest the night of the battle, his wolves abandoning him, his power shattered. Some said he had joined the rogues at the borders. Some said he had died alone in the wilderness. Isabel did not care to know. He was nothing now, and she had no more space in her life for nothing. Olivia came to the cave on the third day. She did not beg for forgiveness. She did not make excuses. She simply knelt at the entrance and said, I was wrong. Teach me how to be something else. Isabel looked at Edward, who stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. He nodded. Rise, Isabel said. There is work to do. Wesley came on the 5th day, and Charlotte, the healer, not the creature, came on the 7th. One by one, the wolves who had been broken by Arthur's ambition returned to the cave, not to beg, but to ask, to listen, to learn. The old ways returned slowly. There was no sudden transformation, no grand ceremony. There were simply wolves who chose to honor the wild again, and a priestess who chose to listen for them. Isabel spent her days in the mountain, learning from Edward, reading her mother's journal, practicing the deep listening that was the foundation of her power. The spiral on her palm had faded, but she could still feel it, a reminder of who she was and what she carried. And at night, she sat with Edward by the pool, watching the crystals pulse in their eternal rhythm, and she let herself be present. Be open. Be the breath between one moment and the next. One night, weeks after the battle, Edward took her hand and led her to the chamber where the first circle was carved into the stone. The crushed starlight glittered beneath their feet, and the fire in the hearth burned with blue-green flames. The circle is complete, he said. The covenant is remade, but there is one thing that has not yet been restored. Isabel asked. He reached out and touched the pendant around her neck. She had restrung it on a new chain, and it hung against her chest, warm and waiting. Bond between wolf god and priestess. The old priestesses carried a piece of the wild within them, and I carried a piece of them. It was the heart of the covenant, the thing that made it more than a transaction. Isabel's breath caught. You want to bond with me? I want to offer you a choice. His golden eyes held hers, and she saw in them the weight of centuries, the loneliness of a god who had watched everything he loved fade away. You can choose to carry a piece of me, as the old priestesses did. Or you can choose to walk away. The covenant does not require it. The wild does not require it. Only I. He stopped, his voice roughening. Only I require it, because I have been alone for too long, and I do not wish to be alone anymore. Isabel stepped into the circle. The starlight flared beneath her feet, and she felt the mountain pulse around her, felt the wild hum in her chest, felt her mother's presence in the pendant, and in her blood, and in every breath she took. I have been alone my whole life, she said. I was alone when they put me on that altar. I was alone when I looked into the darkness of your cave and made peace with dying. And then you came, and you called me a beginning, and I realized. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the silver scars on his cheek. I realized that I did not want to be alone anymore either. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. Isabel, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not the kiss of a priestess and her god. It was the kiss of two people who had been waiting, separately, for something they had not known they needed. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she felt the ember in her chest flare to life, felt something ancient and golden reach out from him and meet it, a thread of light connecting them. The circle blazed, and the mountain sang, and the wild hummed its ancient song. When they finally broke apart, the crystals in the ceiling were pulsing with a light that had not been there before. Gold and silver, intertwined, the colors of the wolf god and the priestess, bound together in a way that had not been seen for generations. Edward rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her lips. "The covenant is remade," Isabel smiled. "The continuation." He laughed, a sound that was young and old all at once, and he kissed her again in the clearing outside the cave. The pack gathered. They had built new homes from the old stones, reclaimed the territory that Arthur had let fall into ruin. The pups were healthy now, the wasting sickness gone, and the rogues at the borders had retreated, sensing something old and powerful awakening in the heart of the forest. Olivia stood at the front of the gathering, her arm around Wesley's waist, Charlotte beside them with her hand on the shoulder of a young wolf who had been born the night the covenant was remade. They looked at the cave mouth, waiting. When Isabel emerged, they went silent. She wore the dress Edward had given her, the dark wool simple but fine, and around her neck the wolf's head pendant glinted in the morning light. But there was something different about her, something that had not been there before. A light, perhaps, or a presence. The wild hummed around her, and the wolves felt it in their bones. Edward stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his golden eyes watching the pack with an expression that was neither judgment nor expectation. He was simply present, waiting. Isabel looked at the wolves who had once called her worthless. She looked at the wolves who had put her on an altar and waited for her to die. She looked at the wolves who had come back, one by one, asking to be something else. She raised her hand, and the wild hummed louder. The trees rustled without wind. The stones beneath their feet pulsed with warmth. "Covenant is remade," she said, and her voice carried further than it should have, echoed longer than was natural. "The old ways are open to those who choose them, not because you are bound, not because you are commanded, but because you are free." She lowered her hand, and the wild settled, humming quietly in the background, a constant presence that had always been there, waiting to be heard. "Who among you chooses to listen?" she asked. Olivia stepped forward first, her hand pressed to her chest. "I choose." Wesley followed, and Charlotte, and the young wolf with the ancient eyes. One by one, the wolves of the broken pack stepped forward, each speaking the words that had not been spoken in generations. "I choose, I choose, I choose." When the last wolf had spoken, Isabel turned to Edward. He was watching her with an expression she had come to know well, the warmth beneath the ancient power, the man beneath the god. "You have done what your mother could not," he said, low enough for only her to hear. "You have restored the covenant, you have given them back their choice." Isabel shook her head. "I didn't do anything, I just listened." He smiled, and it was the real smile, the one that made her heart skip. "That is everything." He took her hand, and together they stood at the entrance to the cave, watching the wolves who had been broken become something new. The morning light filtered through the trees, and the wild hummed its ancient song, and Isabel felt the ember in her chest burn warm and steady. She was not a sacrifice. She was not a weapon. She was not a prize to be won or a tool to be used. She was Isabel, daughter of Mara, last priestess of the old bloodline, and she was the continuation of something that had been waiting, for generations, to be born again. And in the hand of the wolf god, she felt the future unfolding, bright and uncertain. And hers, if you like this story, please like, subscribe, and share to your loved ones.